Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday the 10th of June. I'm Kate Andrews, the Spectator's economics editor, and your host this week. On this week's show, Joe Biden and Boris Johnson meet today as the G7 summit gets underway. What will they talk about, and has the phrase special relationship lost its meaning? We'll be joined by the UK's former ambassador to the States, Sir Christopher Meyer. It comes as the Conservative Party bickers about cuts to foreign aid. We'll be joined by two Tories from opposite sides of the debate, Tim Loughton and Lee Rowley. Plus, an England cricketer has been suspended for sexist and racist tweets he made when he was a teenager. Is cancel culture out of control? We'll speak to Douglas Murray. COVID cases in the UK are rising, but so are the numbers of people who have been vaccinated, with jabs now on offer to 25-year-olds. Should we be worried about a third wave? Edinburgh University's Professor Rowland Kao, who sits on the government's Modelling Advisory Board, will be on the show. And finally, GB News starts this weekend, and its chair is someone who you will be most familiar with. Andrew Neil is back to tell us what to expect. All that to come in the next hour, but before we get going, if you enjoy what we do on Spectator TV, then subscribe to our YouTube channel, click the button at the bottom of this video, and then tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. And if you want to subscribe to the magazine, take up our 12 issues for £12 offer. You'll get 3 months' worth of The Spectator, in print and online, for just £12. Plus, we'll give you a £20 Amazon voucher completely free. Sounds too good to be true? It's because it is. And go to spectator.co.uk/TV offer to take it up. Now, first, we learnt today that Joe Biden issued a formal reprimand to Boris Johnson's government earlier this month over their approach to tensions on the Irish border. But the president seemed in high spirits when he touched down in the UK for the G7 yesterday. What do the two leaders want from the summit? And is the so-called special relationship still a useful framework? I'm joined now by the Spectator's deputy editor Freddie Gray, former British ambassador to the US, Sir Christopher Meyer, and the Spectator's deputy political editor Katie Bowles. Freddie, you write in this week's magazine about the relationship between Boris Johnson and Joe Biden, who will both be gracing the world stage at the G7. What do you think Boris's approach will be to the still fairly new president?
I think it'll be a charm offensive, and I think everybody on both sides, the American side and the British side, are keen to sort of forget about Trump, to put the Trump presidency down the memory hole and pretend it didn't really ever happen. However, I do think there's a slight disconnect between the British side and the American side and how they're approaching each other. I think that Team Boris are very keen to sort of stress the things that Biden and Boris have in common, the shared interests and agenda, and of course there's a lot of truth in that. But I think as far as I can discern from people in Biden world, they're still a little bit suspicious of this slightly Trumpy, as they see him, figure, this populist, this Brexiteer, which is, they are instinctively very anti-Brexit. So I think for all the happy talk, there's still a sort of fundamental misalignment.
Christopher, you were Britain's ambassador to the US between 1997 and 2003. What tends to happen at these kinds of meetings?
Well, an awful lot of preparation for this summit has already happened. I mean, people called Sherpas have been beavering away, drafting communiques, joint statements and all that kind of stuff. So an awful lot of the heavy lifting has been done. And what remains for the leaders is to cross the T's and dot the I's on various, on some of these statements. Now, the question is whether something's going to come out of left field during the meeting that will force them actually to have a really spontaneous discussion of the issues. And I'm not quite sure what that might be. I think on what Freddie just said, I think he's quite right to point out that there will be suspicion in the Biden team about Boris. I mean, in fact, Boris could go anywhere in the world and people would either react with suspicion or with incredulity that such a guy, on some people's terms, has managed to become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. But all that said, if you regard Biden's Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, as being somebody very close to the president who knows the president's mind, I would say that the British team must have been enormously encouraged by Blinken's visit to London. I think it was at the beginning of May. He did a joint press conference with Dominic Raab, the Secretary of State, and out of the lips of Tony Blinken came one of the most fulsome endorsements I have ever heard in my whole life and career of the so-called special relationship. And I think Blinken said something to the effect that the United States has no closer ally. Now, if you regard Blinken as a harbinger of Biden, that's good news. And if we are planning on that basis, I don't think it's too unrealistic.
There have been some reports today that it wasn't all rosy, that the president reprimanded Boris Johnson for his handling of the Irish border. The American side is denying that. Putting that to the side, Katie, what do you think Boris Johnson is hoping to get out of the G7?
I mean, quite a few things. I think the fact it's happening in person is already seen as an early victory for Boris Johnson, because he has had to spend much of his time since winning that majority of 80 trying to build bonds over Zoom, and everyone around the Prime Minister will say he doesn't work very well on Zoom compared to in person. So I think that ultimately trying to shore up these new relations with other leaders is going to be key. I think the Biden first meeting is seen as very important. I mean, we'll talk more about the fact that Boris Johnson doesn't like the sound of the phrase special relationship, but he still wants that relationship to be special. Strategically, Number 10, I think, are putting a lot of thought into how to make sure, when you take into account the fact that the UK and the US have lots in common strategically, they personally will be able to interact well, things they can talk about.
Christopher, Boris Johnson apparently takes exception to the phrase special relationship. I have to admit, I love it, but you've written today that he's right. What was your experience of the way these two countries work together, and why don't you think it's a helpful term?
Well, first of all, I just want to very quickly pick up something which Freddie said, and it's in his excellent article in the latest edition of the Spectator, in which he you know, the question of whether there is a problem in the Biden camp, and particularly with the president himself, with the rather rude things that have been said in the past, A, about Brexit, and B, about Johnson. Personally, I wouldn't worry about that at all. I believe that Joe Biden as a politician is infinitely flexible, and we have seen that in the history of his political operations. If someone like Kamala Harris, who excoriated, eviscerated Biden in the Democratic primaries, can be invited by Joe to become his vice president, then anything can be forgiven. So the baggage of the past, I think, will not be an issue down in Cornwall. As to the special relationship, the problem with it, and this is why I wrote the piece I did today, saying that Boris is right to say to the president, can you soft pedal a bit, please, on this special relationship stuff? And the Americans have already adjusted their language actually to take account of that. Things that I think Jake Sullivan said even today, is because the special relationship had become, in the US-UK relationship, like a holy grail, like a holy relic, pickled in aspic, if you can be pickled in aspic. It was a thing to be worshipped, to be stuck on your mantelpiece and say, look at that wonderful special relationship. It didn't do anything. It didn't do what a relationship is supposed to do, which is to advance the national interest of the two countries that subscribe to the notion of being special. And that is why I think what you're going to see coming out of this summit is a kind of modernized version of the special relationship, which will no longer be a memorial to Winston Churchill and FDR, but an operating live thing. Again, Tony Blinken, when he was in London in the beginning of May, said it is a dynamic thing and it's a useful thing. Well, dynamic and useful I can live with, but with the notion of it being like a beautiful vase, an end in itself, not the means to an end, that is what has become objectionable. And I think Boris is quite right to work against that old vision.
Christopher, do you think domestic politics in the US are going to affect the way that Boris and Biden interact? Obviously, at some point, somebody's going to broach the topic of a trade deal, but it's hard enough at the moment to see domestic policy getting across the floor in the US, let alone international.
Well, I have to say that if I was in the British government now, I wouldn't advise the Prime Minister to press that hard on a UK-US trade agreement, because I think it's going to be very difficult to negotiate with the best will in the world. There are a number of very, very thorny issues. And sometimes I ask myself, given the richness of the mutual investment and mutual trade that goes on anyway, how necessary such an agreement might be. I mean, I think a few months ago, when this government was young, the hard Brexiteers, extreme Brexiteers, were very keen to achieve such an agreement because it would show that Brexit is a success. That kind of neediness is, I think, no longer present, and I think it would be very hard to get through, even with a thin Democratic majority. It would be very hard to get through the U.S. Congress, and for the president to get what is known as fast-track authorization for such an agreement, which means you can't fiddle around with the detail, you can only approve it or disapprove it up or down, I think also would be difficult to get. So I wouldn't be too fussed about this agreement. More important, if I can just make this point, is the fact that even as these guys meet, bilaterally and in plenary, there is a living physical embodiment of the 21st century relationship between Britain and America sailing towards the South China Seas, namely the so-called task force group led by the British flagship HMS Elizabeth, this gigantic aircraft carrier, on which are over a couple of hundred US Marines, US fast jets, and a US escort vessel, among others. There is the modern embodiment of the special relationship, if you like. And the interesting thing will be when this attack, I think it's called an attack group, actually, it sounds a bit menacing, reaches the Indo-Pacific region, the epithet of the moment. The question will be how aggressively it will pass through the South China Seas, and will it or won't it go through the Taiwan Straits? Now that is something for Biden and Johnson to discuss. I wouldn't be too fussed about the trade agreement.
Thank you, Katie, Freddie, and Christopher. Now, the G7 summit comes at a slightly awkward time for the Prime Minister. His government is trying to cut foreign aid spending from 0.7% to 0.5% of GDP. The debate has split the Conservative Party, and the government has avoided a vote on the issue against the Commons Speaker's wishes. Two Tory MPs on opposite sides of this question join me now. Tim Loughton is the MP for East Worthing and Shoreham. He is against the cuts. And Lee Rowley is the MP for North Derbyshire and the Deputy Chair of the Conservative Party. He supports the cuts. Thanks both for joining me. Lee, you support the government's decision to cut foreign aid spending. Can you outline the case for us?
Yeah, I know colleagues feel extremely strongly about this, and rightly so. The question for me when looking at what the Chancellor brought forward a number of months ago was, did it seem reasonable and proportionate, even in a very important area of public spending? And I think given the extraordinary circumstances that we're in, it is reasonable and proportionate to do what the government is doing. I get that people will not necessarily like some of that, and I get that there is challenge, but overall, most people in my constituency are saying that this is a reasonable thing to do, and I broadly agree with them.
Tim, you've said that the decision will mean condemning to death tens of thousands of children from diseases like the measles and malaria. Why isn't the government receptive to this argument, do you think?
Well, I think the government's in a tricky position. Obviously, the finances are pretty precarious because of the pandemic. But this is affecting the whole world. And look, I was an MP who very proudly voted for that 0.7% commitment in the first place. And we have had a manifesto commitment on it ever since. And I stand by that manifesto commitment. I think that's really important. Secondly, this is a flexible formula. It's not as though we are still going to give £15 billion or £20 billion or £10 billion. It goes up when our economy is doing well, and it goes down when we're struggling as we are at the moment. So effectively, this is a double whammy that we're inflicting on people who are in a precarious position already. So we are reducing the amount because of the formula, and now we're reducing the formula further. So I'm afraid it just doesn't work. And at a time when we desperately need to be helping people even more desperate than us.
Tim, how do you address waste? A 2019 report from the Institute of Economic Affairs found that tens of millions of pounds are being spent through the foreign aid budget exporting nanny state programs. This included over £1 million for a research project in India using text messages to persuade people to drink less alcohol, nearly £350,000 evaluating the sugar tax in Chile. It's revelations like these that frustrate taxpayers and make one question if there should always be a guaranteed amount of funding for foreign aid if it's not obviously being spent in the right places.
No, I entirely get that, and we could reel off a whole load of other pretty dodgy projects, the Ethiopian Spice Girls and things like that over the years. And that is wasteful spending, and the money should be going to really important, effective schemes rather than that. But these are a few small projects, and in the bigger scheme of things, these are not the things that are really going to be impacted. This is over £4 billion, which now means that we are going to be seriously cutting something like 80% for clean water projects in Africa in the middle of a pandemic, taking 25% out of girls' education. One of the government's absolutely right top priorities for overseas aid, the food programme in starving Yemen. This is where it will really have the impact.
Lee, it's not a great look, is it, on the international stage when other countries are stepping up their percentage of spending for the UK to be cutting it?
Well, even with this change, even with this reduction, the UK will still spend £10 billion this year. It will still spend more than France. It will still spend more than Austria. It will still spend more than Greece, more than Spain, more than Italy, more than Australia. It will still spend something like 2.5 times more proportionately compared to the United States. And so we just have to be quite careful in terms of the debate in the UK about, which is where we've effectively got to, about whether we're spending a gargantuan amount of money or an incredible amount of money. And whatever happens in terms of the next few months and what the government does, and the government has been clear that it's intending to move to 0.5 for this financial year, we will still be one of the leading contributors of aid all around the world. So for those people who are very passionate about this and very committed to it, they can be proud of the United Kingdom's contribution this year as they can be proud of it in previous years. But we can also accept that the contribution the United Kingdom is making is reflecting the extremely challenging circumstances at home, and recognising that the majority of people who are sat at home, who are watching this or watching other discussions on other parts of the media about it, are in the headspace that there is a recognition that our spending in many areas, not just this, needs to reflect the circumstances which we're in.
Lee, what do you make of the way the government has handled this question? The government says it has no plans to bring forward a vote on these cuts, despite the Common Speaker saying that there really should be a vote. It's clear that if there were, it might be a sticky situation for the government. Are they just going to avoid the question altogether?
Well, I don't think there's a huge amount of opportunity within the parliamentary calendar to hold the government to account. One example was yesterday. I was trying to get in and debate yesterday and ran out of time. I would have appreciated a little bit more time yesterday, so some more of us could have spoken, but that was the Speaker's choice. So, there is an enormous amount of time for us as parliamentarians to have these discussions, questions, written questions, and all the like. I get that there is a desire in parts of Parliament for this to be taken to a vote. We will have to see where that goes. But, I think the government has set out its stall pretty clearly, and Parliament is able to respond should it wish.
Tim, last question to you. Do you think the government wants to hear your voice on this?
Well, I think what the government should be saying itself all the time is what a fantastic job the British government, courtesy of the British taxpayer, has done over many years now, and we don't get enough credit for that. But there are lots of really good projects which we can all be really, really proud of, and I want my constituents to see more of those, because, as Lee says, some of the opinion polls say that people actually will prefer the money to be spent at home. But actually, when you show them how this money is spent, when you ask them the question about, do you actually think we should be spending taxpayers' money on saving lives and food programs in Yemen, or medical programs in North Africa, or whatever, I think most reasonable people will say, well, probably actually yes. And the more evidence we can show of the good that it does, and we are privileged as MPs to be able to go and visit some of these projects and see just the amazing results that they're producing. I want the government to sing more about that. And so it's just so out of character for us to step back at a time when we need to be stepping up. And frankly, for the sake of £4 billion, it's a lot of money, but we've spent over £400 billion in the pandemic. So we're talking about 1% of the extra money we've had to come up with, quite rightly, for the pandemic. But that £4 billion the leverage that it produces, the gearing it produces in terms of saved lives, of growing economies, saving people in desperate circumstances from ending up with people traffickers or whatever, and promoting UK PLC and opening trade links and huge amount of goodwill and standing that it brings for the UK in the world, particularly post-Brexit, is worth hugely more than £4 billion. This is why I think it's a hugely false economy to be doing this.
Well, a follow-up to the last question, Tim. As you say, it's a drop in the ocean compared to what has been spent on the COVID crisis so far. But of course, we're looking at huge budget deficits, skyrocketing debt because of what's had to be done for the COVID crisis. At some point, the government might have to start discussing trade-offs. So if you want the money to be spent in one area like foreign aid, don't you think it's time that the government starts talking about what it might be willing to cut so that we can pay for it?
Well, we're going to be facing some very serious challenges and decisions as to how we get the economy back on track post the pandemic. Now, we need to see just how quickly the economy is going to be able to bounce back. The signs are really encouraging. How much tax revenue we can get back into the exchequer to start paying off some of these debts. But in the next few years, the balance sheet is going to be looking uncomfortable after all the good work that the coalition and then Conservative governments have done to try and get our finances back into shape. The pandemic has completely knocked that for six, but we're not alone in that. That's happened to the whole world. And I think we are in a stronger position because of the action that the government has taken to protect and preserve jobs and businesses so that when we're through it, they can bounce back rather than have to be completely started up all over again. That's how we will pay these bills. But for the sake of £4 billion, as I say, which is I think worth far more in terms of what it brings to the UK, we risk losing an awful lot of goodwill and standing. But most importantly, we risk a devastating impact on some of those people that absolutely need our help and have depended on it.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you, Tim. Next, the cricketer Ollie Robinson was suspended from the England team last week after it emerged that he had put out racist and misogynistic tweets when he was a teenager. He released a video apologising for the comments. Have a look.
On the biggest day of my career so far, I'm embarrassed by the racist and sexist tweets that I've posted over 8 years ago, which have today become public. I want to make it clear that I'm not racist and I'm not sexist. I deeply regret my actions and I'm ashamed of making such remarks. I was thoughtless and irresponsible, and regardless of my state of mind at the time, my actions were inexcusable. Since that period, I've matured as a person and fully regret the tweet. Today should be about my efforts on the field and the pride of making my Test debut, but my thoughtless behaviour in the past has tarnished this.
So does the punishment fit the crime, or is this another example of cancel culture getting out of control? To discuss, I'm joined by Douglas Murray, the Spectator's associate editor, and James Forsyth, the Spectator's political editor. James, can you talk us through what happened?
So Ollie Robinson is a 27-year-old cricketer who now plays for Sussex, and he made his England debut in last week's Test match between England and New Zealand. He took a couple of wickets, but at the end of the first day's play, it came out that when he was a kind of 18, 19-year-old, he'd sent a bunch of crass tweets, bad taste jokes, and that was particularly embarrassing for the ECB, because the England Wales Cricket Board, because all the players before the game had lined up wearing kind of anti-discrimination t-shirts. Then at the end of the match, in which Robinson was probably one of England's better players, the ECB announced that they were suspending Robinson from all international cricket pending an investigation. I think what is particularly tough here is that Robinson is now 27, and he didn't have an easy start to his cricketing career. He was sacked by Yorkshire because of kind of poor timekeeping and general bad attitude. So while he hasn't been punished specifically for the tweets that he sent, he has paid a price for that phase in his life and the kind of general lack of seriousness in his approach to life. And I think that's why the ECB's punishment feels disproportionate.
Douglas, Robinson has explicitly apologised for the tweets which he admits were wrong. You've written that this saga shows that we are unforgiving in the way our society is treating people now. What do you mean by that?
Well, the first thing is, as James just referred to, the fact that this should be done on what would have been Robinson's proudest day of his career to date, his first day playing for England in such a test match. And I think it's, for a lot of people, it just looks like an extraordinarily retributive thing to do. The timing is so vengeful. And going back to what James just referred to in the actual story, we're talking about tweets from 10 years ago, bad taste jokes, basically banter from a young man who seemed not to realize that Twitter was not a medium to communicate with your mates, but was a broadcasting medium to the whole world. These tweets, by the way, at the time weren't even picked up. I mean, they got sort of 1 and 2 likes and things like that. So they didn't gain him anything, but here they are 10 years later looking like they could crash his career. The reason I say that there's something deeply vengeful about it and disturbing about it is not just that element of it, but what's expected afterwards. He was invited to read out a prepared statement before the camera in a scene which I thought looked positively Pyongyang-esque, as he read out his formal apology, expressed how into diversity he actually is, and so on. Here was a young man basically sort of begging for his career, and then he was suspended anyway. That's what I find so disturbing about it. It's not just the sort of archaeological offence business. It's just the fact that, as I've written quite a lot before, we live in a society that's really good on the vengeance. It's really good on the offence archaeology. It's really good at punishing people for erring once in a statement. But we spend no time thinking about how people are meant to redeem themselves.
Yeah, I think Douglas has a very fair point there, which is Ollie Robinson doesn't try and defend his remarks, and he didn't make these remarks as an England cricketer. And I mean, there is a question about how far back we go. But there's another case now involving an unnamed England cricketer and tweets he sent before the age of 16. So how far back into people's pasts are we going? I also think there's an element here of a lack of media savviness. I think if Robinson had maybe a more worldly wise agent around him, for example, he'd have said to him, look, you're going to get a lot more media attention playing for England than you do playing for Sussex. So I suggest you just delete all that social media stuff. Delete whatever. Let's not bother going back through it to see what's there. Just delete it all. I think that's going to become a much more common reaction from people when they know that they're about to be propelled to sudden fame.
One of the other things, by the way, about this that's so disturbing, I think, is this assumption that, our cricketers, our sportsmen, if they represent the national team, they do represent the nation in some way, but they're not a clerical class. I mean, I know some people in sports these days seem to think that they are and think that they have to effectively preach to the terraces, but they're not a clerical class. And I have a question over why it is that we expect them to be these sorts of purer than pure figures. I mean, we have a situation at the moment where there are MPs in Parliament who are actually in our legislative bodies who have said much worse things than Ollie Robinson did. Ollie Robinson did this bad taste banter 10 years ago. Less time ago than that, Zara Sultana, the Labour MP, was tweeting out anti-Jewish racist remarks on Twitter. Now I'm much more disturbed by racist Twitter histories in the House of Commons than I am inappropriate banter from members of the England cricket team. But it seems to be so easy to sort of crush a young cricketer's career, hound some sportsman or woman. And I think there's something completely off about this. I don't look to the England cricket team for morality or ethics or behaviour. I don't want any of that from them. I don't want it from the terraces. I don't want it from the football teams.
James, let's get into the politics of this. Douglas raises the double standard point, but ministers are now getting involved. Culture Secretary Oliver Dowden said that the cricket board went over the top in its decision to suspend Robinson. Do you think he should be intervening?
I must admit, I am wary about both sport getting into politics and politics getting into sport. I think there's but I think that is where this gets tricky. I think it would be much healthier if there was less politics in sport and politicians were taking less of an interest in this kind of question. Because look, I mean, there are various countries around the world at various points in their history where where the national governments have leaned quite heavily on the selection of the cricket team and the like. And I think that would obviously be an absurd route to go down. But I think there is something going on here, which is the reaction just does seem so disproportionate, seeing that Robinson seems to be genuinely contrite for what he said. And I think there is a question, as Douglas said, how do we do forgiveness? At what point can someone say something that is regarded as being enough? And I think having your Test match debut, the proudest moment of your career to date, spoiled in this way, I mean, that seems like a fairly hefty punishment already.
Let's open this up slightly more widely, because it's not just Oliver Dowden who jumped into the culture wars this week. Gavin Williamson also waded into a debate over an Oxford college that wants to take down a picture of the Queen. Is this part of Number 10's strategy now, James, that they're going to weigh into the culture wars more, and perhaps they're not going to wait for Labour to prompt them to do so?
I think the government's attitude to the culture wars has always been to wait, to be responsive, to wait for something to happen that most people will consider silly. This Oxford row is spectacularly stupid. You've got the middle combination room at Magdalen College, Oxford, deciding to remove a picture of the Queen on the basis that you can't disentangle her from the state from colonialism. And if you want to go down this argument about historical privilege and all this, I think you would argue that it's impossible to disentangle Magdalen College, Oxford from it by that logic. They should remove themselves. So it is a truly absurd row. But I also think that that the government wading into it has a certain salience to it, because student unions, let alone middle combination rooms, have done daft things throughout history, and in some ways there can't be that much. I think it is remarkable the spectacular level of interest that this gesture, and it is a gesture, has generated.
It's a very interesting question, this, about the culture wars and the government putting into it, because there's something that I think a lot of our viewers will be aware of that goes on here. The left fights vicious sectarian culture wars on a daily basis. And then whenever anyone of the right does anything pushing back, there are two moves that the radical left makes. They either say, "Oh, how dare you play a culture war?" or they say you're playing a culture war against a problem that doesn't exist, which happens to be manifested daily in their own behaviour. And so when people sort of get into this whole sort of should government get engaged in it, the answer is that the government should stand up for the traditions and the people of the United Kingdom. The government of the United Kingdom is not an NGO. It's not a mere distributor of funds in a multinational level. It is the government of the United Kingdom. It should stand up for the traditions and the good history of our country. I think it is often the case that there are silly things, and I agree that the Magdalen College portrait is a relatively silly case, because you can always find students doing dumb stuff. But nevertheless, when there are serious questions over publicly funded institutions and the ideological drift of them, then it isn't inappropriate, I think, for ministers and others to take an interest in a generational-long leftward drift, which it would be good to see stopped.
Douglas, some thought that Brexit and Donald Trump were fueling the culture wars, and the dial-down of the event and the man might allow for some breathing space. But culture wars seem to have a much longer shelf life than many would have thought.
That's right. I mean, I never bought that argument that, Donald Trump would leave office and the radical left in America would stop pushing. I never bought that. I think it's the same in the UK. There's a particular ideological agenda which the radical left has. It's the same agenda around the world. They're always pushing for the same boring things. And everywhere the right is slightly stymied in what its response should be. There are perfectly reasonable responses the right can play back. But yeah, it's not as if the ideological left was ever planning to take a break simply because Joe Biden's in office or because the Brexit agreement had been reached.
James, on the other side, Trump certainly used the culture wars to his advantage. Now that he's gone, is there just a gaping Trump-sized hole that others are trying to fill? Or is there room for calmer conversation now between the two sides to discuss how they might tackle the big issues of the day?
I think the remarkable thing when you look at polling of the UK is how small the kind of culture war numbers are, and I think that Douglas is right about where most of this starts, and I think it generally tends to start with a small number of kind of highly committed activists on the left who push for a bunch of things, and then you get some pushback, and I think that, but I think in a way, one of the things, the answer to all of these problems, to my mind, is more education, not less. Let's have a debate about the statues in this country, but let's not rip them down. Let's understand why they are there in the first place, what they represent, why people at the time admired them, why people today might think differently. And I think that contextualization is a much better approach to this stuff than trying to silence your opponent, pull down statues, no platform people. I think we can, but I think actually in the general public there is far more agreement on cultural questions than you might think. I think that most people broadly accept that this country has been a force for good in the world, but it has a long history, some of which is inglorious and some of which is glorious. And I think that the public understanding of these questions is actually kind of much more nuanced often than the elite understanding.
Can I just pick up? I agree with James, but just with one caveat, if I may, about the polling of the public understanding of culture wars. As James knows, there's been several polls recently, a YouGov poll, an Ipsos Mori poll on these issues. And they've been used by a number of people from right and left to say that the public doesn't really care about culture wars issues. And the reason that people have claimed that about this recent polling is the relatively low number of people who, for instance, particularly care either way about particular trans issues. Now, there's an obvious reason for that, which is there's a very small number of trans people in society, and the issue is directly affecting relatively few people in any direction. So it's sort of understandable. The reason I wanted to add the caveat is that the exception in this is a very high level of public awareness and dissatisfaction of the racialization of the rhetoric, specifically the use of white as a pejorative term, the lumping in of all white people into one racial category and a negative racial category at that. That's very interesting to me because it suggests that in a white majority country, the majority of people have picked up on the fact that in the culture war, there are things being said now of a racially reprehensible nature which rub the majority up the wrong way. And if I were the radical left pushing some of this culture war stuff at the moment, I would look at those polls and begin to worry.
Well, Douglas and James, thank you for joining me for that conversation. James, before we let you go, we're going to be talking about COVID-19 later on in the show, and a lot of our viewers are going to be wondering about what their summer is going to look like. I've written about my nostalgia for the spontaneous social life in this week's magazine. What is the government's latest thinking on easing lockdown restrictions? When we get to the 21st of June, are we finally going to be free?
So we'll get a decision taken, that there'll be discussions this weekend, and then we'll get a decision on Monday on the 14th on what is going to happen on the 21st. And I think at the moment things are on a knife edge. I think that things are moving slightly in favour of a short delay, depending on, because of the importance of the second dose of the vaccine against the Indian variant. I think there is a thought that if you allowed everyone in priority groups 1 to 9, who account for 99% of COVID deaths, to have had their second dose and achieve the kind of extra immunity that you gain from that, then you would be safer to go ahead with a more comprehensive unlocking. I think as someone said to me, the question now is we know that the vaccines have severely weakened the link between cases and hospitalizations. The question now is how severely? Have they broken it entirely, in which case it would be safe to go ahead with a kind of full unlocking on June 21st? Or is it still there, albeit in much reduced form, in which case I think you might see things like the 1 metre rule continuing for a little while longer. One other issue I would add here, Kate, is that I think it is inevitable that when you lift all restrictions, there will be an increase in cases. So there's also another factor to consider here, which is when do you want to have that? And given that the summer months are generally when there is the least pressure on the NHS, it might be worth having your exit wave in summer rather than in autumn or winter.
Thank you, James. And so on to COVID. Cases are continuing to rise as the Delta variant becomes the UK's dominant coronavirus strain. But with the successful vaccine rollout now meaning 80% of British adults have antibodies to the virus, have we broken that link between cases, hospitalizations, and deaths? And can the 21st of June's Freedom Day go ahead? I'm joined now by Professor Rowland Kao from the University of Edinburgh, who sits on SPI-M, the government's modelling advisory board. Professor, thank you so much for joining me. To start, the big question on everybody's mind is whether or not the 21st of June is going to go ahead. In your professional opinion, and through your work in the government's modelling unit, what advice would you be giving to the Prime Minister?
It is very finely tuned at the moment, and one of the issues that's been coming up lately is that the number of hospitalizations do appear to be increasing, and that is a warning sign that delaying may be worthwhile. Obviously, that only considers the epidemiological aspects, and it is for others to decide whether or not that epidemiology alone is something that's worth making a decision on.
When the government is feeling optimistic, its rhetoric tends to be about making sure that vaccines outpace the virus. Yet you can tell they're getting worried when they start talking about how vaccines aren't 100% effective. It's an odd talking point given that nobody thought we'd reach that standard, and the vaccines we have an excellent efficacy rate. They seem to be falling back on that latter message now, so perhaps that's bad news for reopening.
I think the thing to keep in mind is all the initial data on the vaccine efficacy was for the original type of virus and what we now call the alpha variant. So those are the types that were prevalent prior to this April. The revised estimates of vaccine efficacy show that the Delta variant is somewhat different, and in particular, individuals who only have had one dose of either of the vaccines that we use are only partially protected, and that really, unfortunately, does seem to change the potential scenarios.
You told the Times about a week ago that if hospitalizations and death rates stay low, then all fine. But if we did start to see them go up, then that would be a reason to delay reopening. What numbers are we talking about? Because we know as we have more activity, infections and sadly hospitalizations and deaths will go up. But it's about keeping numbers relatively low compared to those peaks.
Certainly, at the end of the day, it's going to be true that we have to accept that some people will get severely ill and some people will die of COVID-19 almost no matter what we do. And it's really about, will things get so bad that we need to do something different? Unfortunately, it does look like that the information on the deaths alone will be very hard to come by. So hospitalization numbers are increasing. I mean, the good news, if you want to call it that, is that the numbers of deaths are uncertain at the moment, okay, which indicates at the very least there isn't a severe effect of this variant on increasing death rates. But it doesn't mean that there isn't enough of an increase in people going into intensive care, for example, also being an issue, that they don't merit some change. And the biggest thing, of course, is the state of the hospitals and the NHS.
The cover article for this week's Spectator, written by Professor Philip Thomas, says that we are already in the middle of a third wave, a worrying thought. But he says this isn't a reason to delay the 21st of June, and his reasoning is that we're seeing that break in infections and hospitalizations, and that people who are currently getting infected are mostly the unvaccinated, the young, who are significantly less likely to have a severe reaction to the virus. What do you make of that?
So there's a few things to think about there. First of all, we always knew that as restrictions were released, that it was likely we would see more infections. In the absence of the Delta variant, it seemed like those rises in cases, for precisely the reasons that you mentioned, were likely to be acceptable. Okay, that we could get through it without that severe impact. We would balance off the risk and say that, okay, that we will accept that this is going to happen. We don't like it. It's going to be bad for the people who are being affected, but overall, it's the best thing for us as a society. The problem with the Delta variant is it changes the equation quite a bit. And one of the things you have to remember is that as I mentioned earlier, that the number of deaths have not yet been affected because there's always a lag. And the other thing to keep in mind is that thus far, the total number of cases is still low. Okay? And that's a result of the combinations of the restrictions that everybody works so hard to keep up over the winter, the increased effects of vaccination, both of those things having a big effect. So what we're likely to see in the future is further spread. And one of the crucial facts about this is that as you see that greater amount of spread, what we call the infection pressure, so the probability per person that infection will transmit to them, will increase. All right. It'll vary by space and geography as well, also vary by social groups, but overall you will see that rise. And what that means is those people who are partially protected you'll see greater risks in them and greater chances that they will become infected. So remember that the people who have the first dose in particular are probably on the order of, and estimates do vary and they vary between the two vaccines, but on the order of 50% protected. And so their chances of getting infected remain high. And so the crucial question, the absolutely crucial question remains, will they get severely ill? And will they be at high risk of dying? And sadly, it's what we don't know yet. And so the argument for potentially delaying the release of restrictions, that even a few more weeks, one, will give us a better ability to assess that, give time to vaccinate more and more people, because the really good news is that it looks like 2 vaccine doses has a much better protection. Give us that opportunity to get more people vaccinated, move into the summer holiday period, and therefore get to the point where the risk over the summer remain low enough so that we can safely move forward.
And just to break this down and clarify, when you talk about relatively large groups of the population that are still vulnerable, do you mean they're vulnerable to getting the virus? Are we talking about groups that you think were in those vulnerable categories that haven't been vaccinated at all, or perhaps have only had 1 dose, and so they aren't as fully protected as they could be? Because the government has insisted that everybody who would be really vulnerable, the most statistically likely to end up in hospital suffering severe illness from this, have had the opportunity to get the vaccine.
Certainly people are doing as much as they can, and the NHS has done a really good job in making the vaccine rollout better than we would have expected. What we do know from other pieces of evidence is that that vaccine update, as I was mentioning earlier in the conversation, is variable. Okay, so there's some groups of individuals, some of them in certain ethnic groups, in some ways related to deprivation, and some of the issues here are about things like access, for example, as well as personal choice. Those are the groups where there's more likely to be lower vaccine uptake. Okay. Now, the thing that we still don't know is the extent to which we can catch those last groups. And so what you may end up with is substantial portions of the population in particular areas. And these are, and remember, deprivation is also linked to higher probabilities of severe illness, but fairly large numbers in pockets who are highly vulnerable in that sense. And we're not talking about small numbers of individuals here. 5% of the population in certain areas is still a good proportion, a large number of people.
And it's a worrying thought that there would be clusters of really vulnerable people who might be badly impacted if they get this virus. What more can the government do you think, to get these people vaccinated? If you're saying this is a key group of people as to whether or not we can reopen, surely all the focus should be on making sure these people get protected if they want to and choose to do so.
And certainly, there is, as we know, there are issues with some individuals who will refuse vaccines. Okay. Now, the aim would be to, as much as possible, get the others who may not have got it for all sorts of reasons. So it could be about access. It could be about communication. So, for example, missing appointments because you just don't have good access to get it, and things sort of moving forwards. You just need to make sure that the numbers you get of the people who want to are high. Now, I'm not a social scientist, so I'm not the person to talk to you about what those motivations might be, but certainly there are people who look at these things and are saying, okay, part of it is about communication, and part is about just making it easier for people to do, and part of it's about follow-up.
What would a delay to the 21st of June mean for the winter months? Because the implication, if they push back the 21st of June, is that that activity was particularly risky. Do you think there's a plausible scenario where we see more restrictions in the wintertime?
It's something that we have to be prepared for. Now, nobody wants this, okay? Nobody wants this. But the thing we need to be aware of are a number of things when we don't really know the duration of immunity. Okay? We know it lasts a certain amount of time. There's evidence of good protection for people being immune either by natural infection or from the vaccine for at least several months, maybe up to 6 months. But remember, by the time we hit next winter, the people who were initially vaccinated were vaccinated up to over a year before that. All right? So then it becomes down to boosters. Okay, and getting enough boosters out, getting out in populations which maybe is a little bit less aware of COVID, if in fact we get to the point where the numbers have really gone down. And of course, we already know that variants have the ability to take all of our plans and blow them out of the water. Okay, that's happened twice already. Now, all around the world, COVID is spreading with variable levels of vaccination, variable levels of control, and that mix of vaccinated and unvaccinated people in different numbers is unfortunately the situation which most promotes the development of these variants. And so there will remain, especially if we don't maintain good restrictions, good testing at the borders, a high probability that if a variant were to rise elsewhere that is of concern, that it would spread here. And that again can change our circumstances. We don't want to see that happen.
Has it happened though? Because the vaccines have been knocked by the variants several times now, but so far they seem to be holding up. Again, we know anything could change, as the past 15 months have shown us. But so far, they seem to be holding up when it comes to hospitalization and death. And crucially, I mean, those are the two most important metrics to measure. And so if they have held up, all the data for the UK in particular seems to be quite positive. It's the country that wants to get vaccinated most in the world. Yes, there is some vaccine hesitancy, but 90% of the population wants to be vaccinated. The vaccines seem to be holding up. We continue to rank in the top 5 countries for rate of vaccination. Antibody prevalence is through the roof. It's estimated now that roughly 80% of adults in the UK have antibodies. So if there's still these outstanding questions about why we can't meaningfully reopen, a lot of people will be sitting there thinking to themselves, should I just start to prepare for this being the new normal and us not going back to the old one? Now, some people might be content with that, but others are just not going to be able to live with it. So what is the data that we need to see change now, or the updates that we need to see to be able to say that we can reopen and call it a day?
So first of all, just a clarification. When I say that the variants have changed our plans, those are not escape mutants. These are not the vaccine-evading variants. They're variants which changed our response to the non-pharmaceutical interventions. Now, the thing to keep in mind about the evolution of new types of the virus is the evolution responds to the circumstance that the virus is in. Okay, so the virus essentially is a random thing. It doesn't choose in any intelligent way. The vaccine escape variants will only arise when you have large numbers of people who are vaccinated. And so the highly vulnerable time for those variants to arise is precisely as the vaccine numbers are ramping up, but where there's lots of infection. Now remember, Britain has 60 to 70 million people in it. Okay, that is a very small proportion of the entire world. And so even if we have a very high level of vaccination, there is this issue that elsewhere in the world it's far more likely that the variants will arise there, not over here. And so therefore our wariness has to be up at the entire globe, which is again one of the reasons why a global vaccination program that makes sure that everybody has that opportunity that we are very fortunate to have isn't just an issue of helping those countries, it's about helping us.
Last question, Professor. Do you think the UK has gotten its vaccine policy right? Do you think we should have been shipping more vaccines overseas earlier on to protect the most vulnerable around the world rather than distributing them to 25 and 30-year-olds here at home?
That is one of the great wicked problems that we have, isn't it? On the one hand, we really do need to get things moving over here. We do have to have a certain amount of, we need to get the country that we have moving forward. We also need to protect the rest of the world. I am not convinced it's an either or situation. Okay, if we had better synchronization, Okay, synchronization is really the key here. And that requires cooperation, working with other countries around the globe. We can't actually do both. All right, so it's not just about numbers, it's about how do you distribute it, what do you do to make sure that vaccines are distributed, but infection is not, and that's critical.
Thank you for joining me, Professor Kao. And finally, GB News is starting at the weekend. Its chair and one of the presenters is someone who might be familiar to a few of you. Hi, Andrew. Welcome back to Spectator TV. For those that don't know, could you tell them a bit about what you've been up to over the past few weeks?
Well, in addition to my responsibilities at The Spectator, I've been gearing up for the launch of GB News, Britain's new news channel, which we hope is going to launch, if all the machinery will work at the same time, at 8 o'clock on June the 13th, which is this coming Sunday from where we are now. It's a joy to be back on Spectator TV, and really annoying to see how well you've done since I stopped appearing on it.
Well, I can tell you that the viewers really have missed you, Andrew. We still get quite a few comments about it, so I'm glad we cleared that up. And now you can tell us what we should expect from GB News when it launches next week. Is it going to be obvious the ways that GB News is going to set itself apart from the other networks?
I think it will. I think people will maybe take a little bit of time to get used to what we're trying to be up to, what we want to be up to. But I think it will be different in two ways. One is it won't be rolling news. There's enough rolling news around at the moment. That's basically what Sky does, and the BBC News channel as well. And rolling news is repetitive. And because it repeats a lot, the ratings have never been high for rolling news. You get great ratings if there's a Gulf War or a pandemic breaking out. But then once that's over, the rolling news ratings of CNN and Sky and others have found out gone down. So we are not going to be that. We're going to be much more a series of programs starting at 6 in the morning till midnight, built round presenters with a bit of attitude and character, bees in their bonnet, and so on. So it's not so much news-led as presenter-led, with a wide variety of topics. It's what American news channels now do, from Fox on the right to MSNBC on the left. And here's the news: they do rate well. They do rate very well if you get it right. And the second thing is that I think, I take the view, it's not really controversial, but some people get annoyed. I think the existing incumbents, the people who provide news and broadcast news in Britain, Sky, BBC, Channel 4 News, ITV, they pretty much all come from the same stable of varying shades of centre-left attitudes. In some ways, almost like a one-party state. Some are more left than others. Channel 4 News is more left than Sky. Sky these days, remarkably, I think is more left than the BBC. BBC is a bit more left than ITV, which is probably the closest to the centre. And that brings a set of attitudes, whether it's towards Brexit or to cancel culture, or even just an attitude towards Britain, which is pretty much of a muchness. And I think we want to come, without going anywhere in the direction of a Fox News or anything like that, from perhaps a different agenda, a different set of assumptions, and looking at the world in a different way outside that cosy kind of Tony Blairish consensus.
Well, social media is abuzz with the launch, and some people are already convinced that they know exactly what you're going to feature, the tone and the content of a platform that hasn't yet launched. It must be very interesting defending editorial decisions that haven't been made yet.
It's really interesting, Kate, to defend editorial positions that haven't been made, and I'm not quite sure what they'll be yet until we actually launch. Look, the buzz has been fantastic about it. I mean, the one, whether it's positive or negative, I mean, the one thing that, I launched Sky News as part of the overall Sky package way back in 1989. And I do remember then the attitude was a combination either hostility to the idea of a news channel, particularly one owned by Rupert Murdoch, or just indifference. What do we need a news channel for? That was actually true in America when Ted Turner launched CNN, and I was with him the week he launched CNN, and there was kind of indifference to that too. Well, we know what happened there. This is very different. There is a buzz, whether it's hostile or positive. There is quite a big buzz. There's an air of anticipation about it as well. and we have to capitalize on that. People are going to be interested, so we better give them what they're looking for and do it in a way that is going to make them stick. So people are, to a degree I did not foresee, Kate, people, whether it's to smackers or praisers, they are waiting to see the launch of this channel.
It's a competitive industry made more difficult for the newcomer by the fact that the biggest broadcaster doesn't have to compete. The BBC has laws that protect its income and a mandatory license fee if you own a television. Is the way that news has been done before, all these structures, these systems, is that really fit for purpose now, especially as we have many more platforms and people have so much more access to what they choose to watch?
Well, the BBC has its guaranteed income, which it tops up by over $1 billion with its overseas sales and commercial ventures. I think it has a total budget of about $5 billion. And even though its income is guaranteed, it does like to compete. That's sometimes what annoys ITV or Sky, that it does compete. I mean, you couldn't really argue that Strictly Come Dancing was a pinnacle of public service broadcasting, but it's a hell of a ratings winner for the BBC, so they do like to compete. Look, I think the current license fee structure is obviously not fit for purpose in the decade that we've now entered, and there will have to be changes. What they'll be is not for me to get involved in. I've got enough on my hands just running you lot at the Spectator. I mean, that's a full-time job. That's like herding cats on its own, never mind running GB News. But I would say two things. British broadcast news. That's the police coming for me, by the way. We probably haven't paid the rent of the new studios. British broadcast news is among the best in the world and is highly regarded all over the world. Our British broadcasting, whether it's the BBC or Sky or ITN, one of the most famous names in it, or even Channel 4 and their documentaries, we are highly regarded as broadcasters, I would say, among the best in the world. So that's been a good thing. And, Sky News was a great addition. The BBC had to up its game. Sadly, ITV lost interest in news. That was a huge loss because when I was your age, Kate, ITN was a far bigger news name than the BBC. News at 10 on ITV with my old mentor, Alistair Burnett, that was the newscast that mattered. The first half-hour newscast, the first double-headed newscast, massive ratings, 12 million people in these days used to tune in. But things need to change. And I don't think we can remain top of our game without reforms, financing structures coming in and changing. And that's up to the BBC as to how it goes forward with charter renewal. Its biggest mistake would be to think you should just try to hold on to the license fee as is. There will have to be changes. That's for them. What I'm hoping to try and do is just bring a bit more variety, a bit wider discourse, a bit of a different agenda, or even when we cover the same agenda, to come at subjects differently. I'll just give you a general example. There was a discussion on the Today programme about a month ago on the BBC Radio, which, and as you know, like the Second World War, Kate, the whole pandemic business has made big government fashionable again. And big government, the Second World War gave us the Attlee government, which certainly believed in big government, and Mr. Johnson seems to believe in big government too. So the Today programme had this clever idea of debating, is big government here to stay? Good subject. Except that all four people that were on that discussion believed in big government. Well, I think GB News might manage to find at least somebody to say, yeah, hold on, the pandemic was the pandemic. We need to get back to a more Jeffersonian idea of more limited government again. It won't be easy, but that's what we try to do. It's just an example of it. You will know too, the existing broadcasters, if there's a problem that they identify in Britain, and boy, are they good at finding problems. Sometimes problems don't even exist, but they're good at finding them. They come from a point of view which has two suppositions in it. One is if it's a problem, it needs the government to resolve it. And secondly, if the government's to resolve it, it will need more money. So more government, more money. In some cases, that may well be the way to resolve it, but not in every case. And I think we'll come at things just that bit of a different way, which over time people will see is a different kind of discourse and dialogue to the existing incumbent news providers.
Well, let me know if you find anybody of the small state perspective in government, Andrew, because they seem to be sorely lacking these days.
I think we have your number, Kate. I think we have you on speed dial.
Last question, Andrew, and I think the one that people want the answer to the most. Will you still be making an occasional appearance on Spectator TV?
Yes, I will, but only if you ask me nicely. And next time, promise to provide the coffee. I mean...
We're delighted to hear it. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. It's great to be back, and you're doing a great job. Good luck with it.
Thanks, Andrew. We'll be sure to take you up on that offer, and we'll see you soon. And that's it for this week. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel so you never miss out? Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and the bell icon so you don't miss our episodes. Thank you for watching, and do join us again next week.